Okay, then. So we're probably gonna have like some nice music here, something tasteful, but not too flashy. Something like maybe like jazzy. That'll be like right here.
Okay, sounds good. I like it.
Something royalty free.
Something royalty free sounds good. I like it. Love it.
Okay. Well, hello everyone. This is the Midnite Manga Cast. My name's Nathaniel.
And I'm Jeremy.
Thank you for introducing yourself. We're going to talk about my favorite comic of all time, Junji Ito's Uzumaki. It's a wonderfully bizarre manga, and I think that there's a deeper meaning. So yeah, there is a lot of discourse around Junji Ito, like Yo, for instance, which is a wonderful manga, but it's not entirely mysterious, is it?
Not mysterious so much as it's just bizarre. That's the one with the sharks with the insect legs and all that good nonsense and scary stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty open and honest about the story and message it's telling. It's the equivalent of going into a retail store and you ask, "Do you have anything in the back?" And they say, "No, what we have on the shelf is what we got." It's Gyo is about commentary on Japanese chemical warfare experimentation, among other war crimes from World War II that come back to haunt Japan.
Yeah,
Uh,
that makes sense. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone who reads Gil.
No, anybody who does a critical analysis of that comes to that conclusion. It's not really a controversial take on that particular thing. The fish have metallic spider legs. There's a weird carnival with clowns. It's not mysterious.
This guy, however, Uzumaki, I'd be willing to say is definitely not what you see is what you get. Uh, I'd be willing to say there's a lot in the back, a lot to unpack with this one. This is not. There's a lot to figure out, and I'm not even sure that I have figured out what this manga is trying to say definitively.
No, to return to the retail analogy, yeah, there's a lot in the back, probably more in the back than they have like on the shelves. There's a just so much to unpack. It is so mysterious. It's so mystifying. Um, but before we unpack the meaning, Jeremy, you're basically the audience surrogate. So, what was your first impression since this was your first time reading it?
My first impression, um, the first couple chapters, I was intrigued, but mostly like, okay, this is little vignettes in this little kind of creepy town. Where is it going? I kind of expected maybe not a happy end, but uh, some sort of kind of goofy ending where everything gets resolved, and I was completely blown away.
That's cool. Thank you for the first impressions. Uh, for anyone who didn't read it or who's looking for some context for it, Uzumaki ran from 1998 to 1999, written and illustrated by the magnificent Junji Ito. Um, Jeremy and I have the same Viz Deluxe edition of Uzumaki. Do you want to read the little blurb on the back there?
Yes, spirals. This town is contaminated with spirals. A small fog-bound town on the coast of Japan is cursed. According to Suichi, the withdrawn boyfriend of teenager Kirie, their town is haunted not by a person or being, but a pattern. Uzumaki, the spiral, the hypnotic secret shape of the world.
Thanks for that. Yeah. And that's basically all you really need to know about it. It's
This town is cursed. There's spirals everywhere. People are acting bonkers.
um so this is pretty special in the horror world. The only I think legitimate comparison that could be made and defended is of course to our very own Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
Yes, that was something that immediately struck me when I was reading this, and after I finished it and was doing my own research. Um, I kind of looked up some stuff after I was done, and I was not surprised at all to find out that Mr. Junji Ito goes on the record to say that H.P. Lovecraft is one of the major influences on this particular work. Um, not surprising at all. That made a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think I really do appreciate the comparisons that people make, but it is a little bit misleading when it comes to interpreting this work in particular, I think. So before that, I want to read you a quote from H.P. Lovecraft. You probably heard it before. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. So that could be pretty generally applied to the theme of a lot of Lovecraft's work.
Absolutely. The most obvious, the most famous of stories, Call of Cthulhu. Uh, I mean, the the most scary thing of the whole thing is, oh my goodness, like where does this come from? Are we equipped to deal with it? It's a mystery of tracking down, and then at the very end, we're left with more questions than we are with answers.
Yeah, exactly. And I think someone who is familiar with Call of Cthulhu who goes right into Uzumaki is going to be in a difficult mindset to accept it and read it on its own terms, I think. Because I think certainly Uzumaki is about fear of the unknown, but a specific type of unknown. Certainly with Lovecraft's work in the cosmic horror genre, it's a ignorance is sort of the defining feature of the unknown.
It's okay. Yeah, that's fair. Ignorance. We're not quite aware of all the cosmic entities and all that is going on in the universe. But you don't think that that is the same thing for here? It's not ignorance.
No, in Uzumaki, it is not ignorance. It is something that was definitely known before. It is definitely a fear of the forgotten, that specific type of unknown. So,
I see.
so I want to turn in our matching book club editions of Uzumaki to page 577 in chapter 18.
And feel free to turn to 577 if you have a copy of Uzumaki at home.
So this page in particular, in context, I think is sort of the turning point in trying to uncover meaning here. So,
Yes.
so if you have like I don't know, a mental bulletin board, like pin that there.
This is the key to understanding Uzumaki.
This is the key to understanding the mystery of the spiral.
Okay.
Not really. We are not going to uncover the mystery of the spiral. That is not the point. But yeah, do you want to read the last three panels on that page?
Last three panels, 577. Yes. Okay. Shuichi talking. The row houses are made of wood, so they can't be that old. And yet, the story was never passed on. Maybe all memories of it were lost. Lost? It could be that every person who could have told that story vanished.
Yeah, so very much the horrors that are going on in the town of Uzumaki were known at one point. Someone is aware of it. There is certainly an implied knowledge that does exist in this world about the spiral, but it's just lost to time. It's forgotten. That's very different from the type of knowledge about in H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, where it's entirely new. It's entirely playing off of this ignorance and the fear that comes from that.
So instead of ignorance for here, there's something important and vital that has been forgotten.
Exactly.
That's not okay. That's not the conclusion I came to when I was reading it. However, I'm also not from Japan, so is there something that I'm missing here?
I think what has been forgotten is something that as Westerners we probably wouldn't have figured out by ourselves. I think it's a specific Japanese thing going on here. What's been forgotten?
All right, what has been forgotten?
Well, I feel like in my research for this, I found that there is a lot of talk about the Japanese identity.
Okay, Japanese current identity, or specifically the Japanese identity. Well, I don't know, pre World War II, I guess,
Well, sure. I mean, that's certainly part of it. Um,
or just a general Japanese identity.
well, I mean, that's the thing is that the Japanese identity has been in flux for hundreds of years.
Ah,
I mean, like there's like a whole history of like of the Japanese trying to figure out what makes us who we are. And then there's actually a term for this. It's called Nihonjin Ron. Nihon meaning Japan, Jin meaning people, Ron meaning theory. So that literally translates to Japanese theory, the theory of Japaneseness, I suppose.
okay.
The translated Nihon Jinron is Japaneseness a lot of times.
Mm,
So certainly yeah, there's a quote on this. The Japanese term Nihon Jinron refers to discourses on the distinctiveness of the society, culture, and national character of the Japanese. As such, Nihon Jinron have manifested themselves periodically from the Meiji era to the present, while continually undergoing changes in form.
okay. And what you're putting forth, this is interesting. Concept. It's so interesting that they have like a specific phrase for figuring out a identity for them as a people. But my question is Uzumaki in its relation to that trying to propose what the Japanese identity is, or is it proposing that there is a vital bit of history that has been left out that is causing problems to the Japanese identity? Is that where you're going with this?
My thesis on Uzumaki is that the mystery of the spiral is analogous to the mystery of the Japanese identity. It's a undefined thing in Japanese culture. It's a sort of an undefined, unspoken standard for them that they're always trying to live up to and achieve. Um, I think that's what I'm going with this. It's since I feel like the mystery of the spiral in the context of the world of Uzumaki is unattainable. It's unsolvable. It's inherently mysterious. I feel like that's analogous to trying to live up to this standard of what being a Japanese person is.
Okay.
So I have to ask, what do you think is forgotten in Uzumaki?
What do I think is forgotten?
What have they forgotten? Yeah.
Well, if we're talking literally speaking, um, everyone in this previous spiral town that is revealed to be underneath the town, there's this whole spiral city that has literally been forgotten. Uh, but I'm guessing you're not asking what has literally been forgotten, right?
No, I feel like that is the key to sort of understanding this metaphor.
Oh,
The name of the town, Kurozu Cho, literally means Black Spiral Town.
okay.
And yet they've sort of forgotten about this spiral city that's beneath them. They've forgotten their own history. They've forgotten the namesake of their own town.
Really pretty embarrassing.
Pretty embarrassing indeed. But I think most importantly, if we want to figure out what's forgotten in this manga, I think we have to talk about what is omitted, what isn't there, what is something that they don't talk about, or what is not mentioned here, what's missing here.
Um, well, something that always I thought was very interesting. I don't know if this is what you're going for, but I always thought it was interesting that no one really acts like anything is really out of the ordinary, at least not in a natural way. There's goofy stuff going on. There's people acting like mosquitoes. There's people obsessing over spirals. There's all these people turning into Jack in the Boxes, and people don't move. It's if I'm gonna pick anything that was omitted, it's common sense to leave the town. But I guess we wouldn't have a story if everyone acted with common sense.
Sure, but there's also this sense where people aren't acknowledging this major horrifying thing that is happening in their town.
That is true. There's never really a town meeting called asking, okay, what's going on here? Let's discuss.
Hmm.
What's causing these spirals?
Hmm.
So that's true.
Nobody is proposing any solutions. Nobody's acknowledging that there is in fact a spiral curse. Shuichi is the only character who's sensible about the whole thing, who identifies what the problem is, and people act like he's crazy. You know what I find most interesting about this particular manga is that there isn't, in any direct way, a mention of religion.
Uh, oh, I never noticed that. There is never there's never any mention of spiritualness or religion or any kind of mention of that, which is that's even unusual for the horror genre in of itself. If this was a Stephen King book, for example, there would already be some sort of religious cult developed around the spiral, the stand style about it. That's right. There's never any sort of religious elements. And this is okay. This is the omission that you're talking about.
This is a very important omission. Absolutely.
This is the omission. Is religion.
This is what's been forgotten, I think. Or at least this is what's part of it. I think this is the key to figuring out what's been forgotten in a way.
Japan's spiritual side, Japan's religious side.
Well, here's the thing is that religion in Japan isn't comparable to the red flag that it is here in the West. Like you
It,
mentioned in any Western horror story, or especially those written by Stephen King, there'd be a religious death cult. Like that's like just how those types of stories pan out. There's always a mention of God, and it's interesting that there wouldn't be any type of mention of that in a Japanese story. But there is it is also worth mentioning that religion in Japan isn't like it is here in the West. Like the religion of Japan, Shintoism, is not like Christianity. It's not. It's just not comparable.
that's true, and at least from my understanding. Although also, you can stop me here. I've never been to Japan. I'm an ignorant Westerner, but my understanding of religious uh, um, symbols in Japan is this: it's tied to their culture.
It is.
It's very commonplace. It has a very big influence on their architecture, on their landmarks, their culture. Uh, yeah, I might be completely talking from ignorance here, but kind of seems like in most Japanese media, anime, manga, whatever it is, it's super common to be like, okay, let's stop by the shrine and say a prayer so we do well in our test or something like that. It's New Year's. Let's go say a prayer for the new year. Let's there's temples and shrines everywhere in Japanese media. There's um, like Buddhist imagery and symbols all the time. So
It
it's very much tied to their culture. It's
Yes, it is,
very
and yet in this fictional small town in Uzumaki, there isn't a single torii gate. There's not a single Jizo statue. There isn't a shrine, either a Shinto or a Buddhist shrine anywhere. There isn't mention of spirituality really much at all. Not directly, anyways.
not so there is. Wait, okay. So what is is there an indirect mention of spirituality and religion that I missed? Because I'm not, I don't remember this at all.
Well, I'm going to build up to that. But
Okay.
for now, I think you did hit the nail on the head when it comes to what Shintoism is over in Japan. I have a quote here from Shinto, the Kami Way. It is in its general aspects, Shinto is more than a religious faith. It is an amalgam of attitudes, ideas, and ways of doing things that through 2 millenniums and more have been an integral part of the way of the Japanese people.
Hmm. So my question, and let me know if you're building up to this. We can answer it later. Is Junji Ito trying to say in Uzumaki that Japan needs to get back to Shintoism. Is that what you're trying to say about Uzumaki?
Well, yes and no. I think that is certainly an interpretation, but I'm not there yet.
Okay.
I'm not there yet. But I just find it very interesting that you're in a cursed town and you don't, no one seems to even offhandedly mention, hey, maybe we should say a prayer or maybe we should have a little ceremony to ward off the curses. Nobody,
Did we upset the gods or whatever it is, the spirits?
nobody even once asks, even offhandedly. There isn't like an old man character in the back who says, oh, we upset the kami. Nobody says that. Nobody mentions that. It's never brought up. But yeah, no, in Japanese media, it seems intentional that religion isn't mentioned here.
That is a pretty big omission. And you think that this was done on purpose? Was this? Do you think this is an accident? Do you think that Junji Ito specifically omitted religion and Shintoism from this book?
I do think it's intentional. I think how do you communicate something more effectively, like or maybe not communicate, but I feel like in trying to identify what's forgotten, I think you have to look for what isn't there. And I can't believe that religion was entirely omitted on accident. I feel like you have to go out of your way to not have some mention of spirituality.
Hmm.
Because in so many ways, Shintoism is an integral part of the way of the Japanese people, going back to the quote from before.
Yes.
Are you familiar with Japanese history at all?
I have only watched the Bill Wirtz History of Japan video. That is all I know, and it's been a couple months since I watched the video, so I'm open ears. Fill me with knowledge about the history of Japan.
Well, it's an oversimplification of their history, but it's actually really helpful. Um, yeah, it was a very much a intentionally isolated nation. They didn't want people in, and then the Americans came with guns and boats, the gunboats, and they forcibly opened the country in a way.
We're gonna share the ways of freedom by invading Japan.
Yeah, and that was in 1857.
Typical America.
And a lot of people weren't really happy about that in Japan. So they decided, hey, we don't really like the way that our government, the shogunate, handled this situation. So we're just going to redo this whole thing. And they restored the emperor, who had not been in power for a while. That's why it's called the Meiji Restoration.
Okay.
And they essentially, that happened in 1868, and essentially the Japanese decided, we are going to redefine what it is to be Japan. What it
Once
is to
again, back to the question of what is the Japanese identity. Okay,
this
goes back so often. Okay.
what does it mean to be Japanese? Absolutely. So, and a big part of this was, of course, we don't really like this foreign interference, so we are going to push out anything that isn't Japanese, and we are going to embrace at every part a hyper nationalistic Japanese, way of doing things.
Okay.
So this
my question is then,
mm-hmm.
At what point did that not stop? At what point did that stop being a thing? Because I think when you look at current day Japan, that is not how it is right now. And that might be too complicated a question, but I feel like this is where we're going with it, right?
This is where we're going. This is
Okay,
exactly
cool.
the next point, is the Shinto Directive of 1945, which essentially separated church and state.
Oh.
But what you have to understand is that religion was intertwined with their government, the government of Japan, and in 1945, their government surrendered. So this essential expression of the Japanese identity was essentially redefined and sort of shattered in a weird way.
This is definitely from my understanding, the most important crisis of identity that they had to deal with for a long time. And from what we're talking about, it seems like all of a sudden, okay, our government is defeated. And not only that, since our way of life, our religion is directly tied to our government, that means that our religion all of a sudden has been defeated as well.
So it seems intentional to me that there is no mention of religion or spirituality in this manga, even though it's an integral part of Japanese culture, save for one indirect reference in chapter 7. So this is, of course, the Jack in the Box chapter. So here is the only indirect mention of Japanese spiritualism in their culture, and it's very indirect. It's when the Jack in the Box, Mitsuru Yamaguchi, he gets run over by a car, and instead of being cremated, he's buried.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That was a really important part of the story. At least it was a reoccurring theme. Any time that someone died, and lots of people die up to this point, they were always cremated, and there was always a huge black spiral that spins up into the sky.
Well, it's also interesting that in 1999, when this was published, 98.42% of the dead in Japan were cremated.
That's like everyone.
So it's interesting to me that in this world they just switched to burial. They just, like, cremations were done with that. There was only one other time in Japanese history when cremation was banned, and that was during the Meiji Restoration. So here's a little quote that'll give you a condensed history lesson here. So when the basic features of Japan's modernity were being argued into existence in the wake of the Restoration of 1868, in the middle of this turbulent decade, cremation became the subject of intense controversy. Reviled by Confucians and nativists alike, it was outlawed in the summer of 1873. The outlawed practice was understood by both its supporters and detractors to be a specifically Buddhist mode of handling the dead, originating, like Buddhism itself, in India. So, for a very brief period of time, cremation was banned because burial was considered the more Shinto, and by extension the more Japanese, way of doing things.
Okay, so back to the story of Uzumaki. In the context of the story, we have the spiral curse that comes to this town anytime somebody dies. That is when it's spiral related, they get cremated. There's a black spiral smoke that goes up into the sky, and all of a sudden they switch back to burial, and this is directly because of the spiral itself, that they have returned back to Shintoism and a Shinto way of doing things.
Absolutely. Now, this is the first time in the story where religion is mentioned, and it's also the first time where we see the town of Kurozucho sort of going back in time in their ways of doing things.
Right, there is this, there's a reoccurring theme of going back to an older way. There's this, and there's also the houses that they go back to, the row houses. Inexplicably, all of the older buildings crumble away, and they aren't able to stay structurally sound with all this spiral destruction going on. But the old houses, the old row houses, are able to stay intact. And so by one, they go back to burial, which is an older traditional thing. 1, 2, they go back to this older style of architecture, because that's the only thing that's going to be able to hold up with all this spiral destruction going on.
Yeah, no, it can be said that the spiral is forcing the town to refamiliarize itself with the older ways of things.
So, okay, I feel like I've asked this question before, but I want to ask it again now that we've covered a couple of those things. Is Junji Ito saying that we need to go back to traditionalism? Is he trying to say we just need to remember stuff that has been forgotten? Or is he trying to say that there's this terrible force and that we don't need to remember it because it's this terrible amount of destruction that brings us back to traditionalism? And whenever we have a terrible force, traumatic experiences, we cling back to our traditions and it leads us to, not great things. What is he trying to say here? There's all these little building blocks. There's all these little supporting bits of evidence, but I'm not sure what this culminates to in the end. What is he trying to say?
Well, I'm pretty sure Junji Ito is not a nationalist, so that's good. No, but I think it's important that the first case of the spiral obsession is with Shuichi's dad. If you remember in chapter 1, of course, Shuichi's dad sort of gives up everything that defined his identity beforehand to embrace the spiral.
That's all he does. He has a whole room filled with spirals, and it's even kind of, he almost neglects even his family around him for these spirals.
Yeah, he gives up every part of his life. He literally gives his own body to the spiral.
Yes.
So, and certainly it is, I believe the narrative is framing this as a very unhealthy thing. So if we're looking at this in the larger context, we see the dad, Shuichi's dad, embracing his town's historical culture to a point that he gives up all the other values and things that used to identify him or were valuable to him.
And it's not good. It's kind of a bad thing.
In a very unhealthy way. But this is bookended with the following chapter with Shuichi's mom, where she rejects everything that her husband embraced. She rejects the cultural history of her town. She drives herself to a suicide in order to avoid the spiral. So I believe when Junji Ito put these two chapters right in the forefront, he's sort of giving us a framework on how to judge how these characters should approach it. It's not by blind obsession, and it's definitely not by this entire rejection.
It's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, it's somewhere in the middle, absolutely.
So Junji Ito, he's not a nationalist. He's not saying we need to completely go back to our roots. And when we do completely embrace it and we cast aside all other attributes or defining features, we twist ourselves into this grotesque monstrosity. However, he's also saying that a complete ignorance, a complete throwing away of tradition is also not good, because at the end of the day, she has a similar fate. She still meets her end when she ignores it completely.
Well, because there's this idea that the people in this town are in the spiral whether they like it or not. They're in this cycle that they can't escape. So regardless of what they choose to do, they're going to have to come face to face with the spiral. They'll have to.
Piggybacking off of that idea, there was a specific chapter that I think really also illustrates that idea. In chapter 11, the umbilical cord, it's really creepy. It's really, really gross. But we are this chapter takes place in a maternity ward, and we have all these folks that have just given birth, and very creepily, all the babies can talk, and they're very creepy. But what they're talking about is they demand, we want to go back to the womb. Now that's pretty creepy, and you can just read that for what it is. That is just silly and gross and a horror, Japanese horror, if ever there is it. But that is definitely a definitive illustration of going back and wanting a safer environment. I'm reading this as the babies have been born and they're like, man, this stinks. I don't like living out here. I don't like the real world. I want to go back where it's safe and warm. I want to go back in my mother's womb and just stay there forever. Do you think that, am I digging too deep there, or do you think that ties well back into Japan has this cultural crisis? They have a defeat of some kind, and all of a sudden we need to retreat back where it's safe, where we know we're good, we know we're safe. We need to go back to our cultural identity, figure out our past, and go back to that.
No, I think you're onto something there. Certainly, I sort of just wrote that chapter off as just kind of gross, but when you lay it out like that, I can't in my right mind deny that connection.
All right, nice. So if we are saying that the spiral is a representation of Shintoism, of Japanese culture, if we're taking that approach, what we can glean is, one, we can't be so obsessed with it that, you know, we're killing ourselves, but we also can't be completely ignorant of it. We can't completely run away with it.
It's like that old saying, those who don't understand their history are doomed to repeat it.
That is exactly what happens.
That's like in a sentence maybe the message of Uzumaki. What do you think? Is that too oversimplified?
It might be too oversimplified, but I think you hit the nail right on the head with that one. That's literally what happens in the story. Nobody remembers the history of the town or what came before, and it's their undoing. They literally revert back to this spiral city, and it's heavily implied that it's going to happen again.
Yes, it is.
I think they actually spell it out.
They do say it. They say it will happen again. A new Kurozu-cho will be built on the ashes of the old one.
Yeah, the town will rebuild, blah, 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 blah. The whole town will develop, and eventually this spiral curse is going to happen again. Anyway, all right, cool deal. So we covered this idea of Japanese cultural identity and Japanese theory. We talked a little bit about the history of Japan and Shintoism. All right, so we just got done talking about Uzumaki, really riveting stuff. I thought that was really fun. All right, and you've completely sold me on Junji Ito. I think he's a genius. What would you recommend next? What's the next Junji Ito story? Or maybe even what's the next Japanese horror that I can delve into that deals with similar themes? What would you recommend next? What's the next step?
We offhandedly mentioned Gyo, another work by Junji Ito. If you liked Uzumaki, you'll probably enjoy that. He's got a ton of short stories that you'll probably like. If you wanted a recommendation in movies, don't watch the Uzumaki film adaptation. It's not very good.
Okay, I'll avoid that.
It's maybe fun for a laugh, but it's not worth your time. No, if you want a movie that's maybe not a horror, but explores some of the same themes of Hayao Miyazaki and Junji Ito, I would recommend Akira. I think it's you sort of have to dig deep in the subtext for the reading in Akira, but there is definitely a lot to do with the Japanese identity and industrialization, and it's all there if you're looking for it. It's got all the grossness of Junji Ito, but it's not quite the horror package. So that would be my film recommendation.
All right, sounds good. Maybe we'll talk about that next time.
Or maybe we'll talk about Bone, since we talked about my favorite comic.
All right, sounds good to me. All right, well, that's all I had. We ready to end this thing?
Yes, we are. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.